In the history of the American justice system, the death penalty for women remains a rarity. Since its reinstatement in 1976, only a small number of women have faced the ultimate transition from death row to the execution chamber. In this documentary, we explore the cases of women who committed serious crimes, examine the circumstances of their final moments, and reveal the last words and meals that defined their end. 1. Velma Barfield, North Carolina. In the 1970s, Velma Barfield's life appeared ordinary to those in her community, but behind closed doors, a darker pattern was emerging. It began with the death of her boyfriend, Roland Stewart Taylor. Velma had been poisoning his tea and beer with arsenic. As investigators dug deeper, they found a trail of bodies. Her ex-husband, Jennings Barfield, had died in 1970 under similar circumstances. While working as a caregiver at a nursing home, several patients died unexpectedly, including her own mother, Lillian Bullard, in 1974. When Jennings' body was exhumed, it was found to be riddled with arsenic. Although suspected in several deaths, she was officially convicted for the murder of Roland Taylor. On November 2, 1984, hours before she was to become the first woman executed in the modern era of the death penalty, Velma Barfield made a peculiar and simple request for her final meal: a bag of cheese doodles and a 12-ounce Coca-Cola. Dressed in pink pajamas and wearing an adult diaper for the procedure, Velma was led to the chamber in a North Carolina prison. Her final statement was one of remorse. "I know everyone has gone through a lot of pain. All the families are connected, and I am sorry. I want to thank everyone who has supported me through all of these 6 years." At 2:15 a.m., the lethal injection was administered. Doctors confirmed her death shortly after. Velma Barfield made history as the first woman to be executed after 1976, closing a dark chapter that spanned over a decade of deception. 2. Carla Faye Tucker, Texas. In 1983, the state of Texas was rocked by a brutal double homicide. Carla Faye Tucker, acting under a heavy influence of substances, participated in a violent robbery that claimed the lives of Jerry Dean and Deborah Thornton. During her trial, Carla's behavior was shocking. She appeared high in the courtroom and expressed that she felt a surge of pleasure during the commission of the murders. Due to this extreme lack of empathy, she was sentenced to die in 1984. During her 14 years on death row, Carla underwent a radical change. She converted to Christianity and became a vocal advocate for the power of redemption. Her case drew international attention, with even the Pope and various world leaders calling for her sentence to be commuted. On February 3, 1998, at the Huntsville prison in Texas, Carla requested a healthy final meal consisting of a banana, a peach, and a fresh garden salad served with ranch dressing. The execution and last words. Before the lethal chemicals were administered, Carla looked toward the families of her victims and her own loved ones. Her last words were, "I am so sorry. I hope God gives you peace with this. I love you all very much. Now I'll be face to face with Jesus. I'll wait for you." She was pronounced dead at 6:45 p.m., the first woman executed in Texas since the mid-1800s. 3. Judy Buenoano, Florida. Born Judius Welty in 1943, Judy's early years were defined by hardship. After her mother died when she was only 4, she was shuffled through foster homes and lived with various relatives, reporting a childhood of severe abuse. By the age of 17, she had already spent time in a reformatory and had given birth to her first son, Michael. This turbulent beginning preceded a life where she would use her intelligence not for survival, but for calculated gain. Judy became known as the Black Widow. In 1971, she moved to Florida and began a pattern of progressive poisoning. Her husband, James Goodyear, died after a mysterious illness shortly after returning from a tour of duty. In 1978, her boyfriend, Bobby Joe Morris, died in Colorado under suspicious circumstances. Years later, arsenic was found in his remains. Her most chilling act occurred in 1980. Her son, Michael, had become paraplegic due to arsenic poisoning he didn't know his mother was administering. While on a lake trip, Judy pushed her son's wheelchair out of a canoe, and he drowned. Her spree finally ended in 1983 when she tried to murder her fiancé, John Gentry, using a car bomb. The day before her execution, she was offered a final meal. She chose a selection of fresh vegetables and fruit: broccoli, asparagus, strawberries, and a cup of hot tea. On March 30th, 1998, at the Florida State Prison, Judy was strapped into the electric chair. She had spent 13 years on death row. When the warden asked if she had any last words, she chose to remain silent, maintaining a cold exterior until the end. She was declared dead at 7:13 a.m. 4. Betty Lou Beets, Texas. Betty Lou Beets was born in 1937 and grew up in a world of extreme poverty and instability. By the time she was a young adult, she had entered a cycle of short-lived, often volatile marriages. She had been married 5 times, and many of those relationships were marked by claims of domestic violence. This history of broken homes and repeated trauma eventually culminated in a desperate and deadly solution to her marital problems. In 1983, Betty reported her 5th husband, Jimmy Don Beets, missing from their home in Texas. She claimed he had gone fishing and never returned. However, her story unraveled when her son, Robert Branson, confessed to police. He revealed that Betty had shot Jimmy Don and that they had buried him in the backyard under a decorative planter. When investigators began digging, they found more than they expected. They discovered not only the remains of Jimmy Don Beets, but also the body of her 4th husband, Doyle Wayne Barker, who had vanished years earlier. She was convicted of capital murder for the death of Jimmy Don. Betty Lou Beets spent 15 years on death row. For her final meal, she did not request anything special, accepting the standard prison menu of the day. On February 24, 2000, at the Huntsville unit in Texas, Betty was prepared for lethal injection. Like Judy Buenoano before her, when asked for a final statement, she remained silent. She was 62 years old at the time of her death. 5. Christina Marie Riggs, Arkansas. Christina Riggs was a licensed practical nurse, a profession dedicated to saving lives, which made her crimes all the more incomprehensible. She had a history of clinical depression and had struggled with the pressures of being a single mother. Her early life was marked by a feeling of being overwhelmed by the world, leading to a distorted view that the only way to save her children was to take them with her when she ended her own life. In November 1997, in a state of deep despair, Christina decided to end the lives of her children, 5-year-old Justin and 2-year-old Shelby. She attempted to use a chemical substance she had taken from the hospital, but when it caused Justin visible pain, she smothered them both. She then took a large dose of medication herself, but was discovered 19 hours later and revived by doctors. During her trial, she famously told the jury that she did not want a defense and welcomed the death penalty. For her last meal on May 2, 2000, she requested a feast of comfort food: supreme pizza, a side of salad, fried okra, cherry and lime soda, and a slice of strawberry pie. In her final moments, she was tearful and deeply apologetic, Her last words were a message to her lost children. "There are no words to express how sorry I am for taking the lives of my babies. Now I can go back to my children as I had always wanted to. I love you, my babies." She was the first woman executed in Arkansas in over 150 years. 6. Wanda Jean Allen, Oklahoma. Wanda Jean Allen's life was marked by intellectual and developmental challenges from a very young age. Born in 1959, she suffered a traumatic brain injury at the age of 12, which her defense attorneys later argued significantly impaired her judgment and impulse control. Growing up in a fractured environment, she struggled with a low IQ and spent much of her youth drifting between menial jobs and run-ins with the law. By the time she reached adulthood, she had already served time for a previous manslaughter conviction in the 1980s, a precursor to the violence that would define her final years. In 1988, Wanda Jean was in a volatile relationship with Gloria Jean Leathers. Their partnership was fueled by frequent heated arguments. On December 2nd, after a particularly intense dispute at a local grocery store, Leathers attempted to flee to the Oklahoma City Police Department to file a report and seek protection. As she stepped out of her car in front of the station, Wanda Jean was waiting. In full view of the police department, Allen shot Leathers in the abdomen. Gloria Jean succumbed to her injuries 3 days later. Because of her prior violent record, Wanda Jean was sentenced to death in 1989. During her 12 years on death row, Wanda Jean underwent a religious conversion. When the day of her execution arrived on January 11, 2001, she made no special request for a last meal, opting instead for the standard prison fare. As she lay on the gurney, surrounded by 24 of the victims' relatives, Wanda Jean remained composed. Her final words were a plea for divine mercy. "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." In a moment that many witnesses found unsettling, she smiled at her legal team and stuck out her tongue, a final gesture that some viewed as a defiant farewell. She was pronounced dead at 9:21 p.m. 7. Marilyn Plants, Oklahoma. Marilyn Plants lived what many believed was a quiet, suburban life in Oklahoma. However, beneath the surface of her marriage to James Plants, a hard-working maintenance man, was a growing dissatisfaction and a desire for a lifestyle she felt her husband could not provide. Her early adult life was focused on raising her 2 children, but as she entered her 30s, financial greed began to outweigh her loyalty to her family. Marilyn's motive was cold and calculated, a $300,000 life insurance policy. In 1988, she convinced her teenage lover, Clifford Bryson, and his friend William McKimble to ambush her husband. As James returned home from his shift at the local newspaper, the 2 men beat him nearly to death with baseball bats while his children slept in the next room. When the men hesitated to finish the job, Marilyn reportedly told them to make sure he's dead. They eventually placed James in his pickup truck and set it on fire to stage a fiery accident. The cover-up failed almost immediately when the accomplices confessed. On May 1, 2001, Marilyn requested an extensive final meal, a chicken taco salad, 2 soft chicken tacos, a Mexican pizza, 2 cinnamon rolls, a slice of pecan pie, and 2 cans of Coca-Cola. Before the lethal injection was administered, Marilyn spoke to her family, specifically her children, who were not present. She quoted scripture and stated, "I want to tell my whole family that I love them very much. What God has given me is love, and I have overcome the world. Nothing can separate us from the love of God." She was executed exactly 12 years to the day after her death sentence was originally handed down. 8. Lois Nadine Smith, Oklahoma. Lois Nadine Smith's background was rooted in the rural landscape of Oklahoma. Known to be fiercely and often dangerously protective of her son, her life was shaped by a defensive and eventually paranoid worldview. Her early years were spent in traditional roles, but as her son grew older and became involved in his own interpersonal conflicts, Lois took it upon herself to act as his enforcer, often resorting to intimidation to solve family disputes. In 1982, fueled by a paranoid suspicion that 21-year-old Cindy Bailey had hired a hitman to kill her son, Lois took matters into her own hands. Along with her son, Lois kidnapped Cindy and drove her to a remote house. There, the situation turned into a scene of prolonged torture. Lois beat and stabbed the young woman in the throat before finally shooting her 9 times. During the trial, her defense argued she was under the influence of substances and was only acting to protect her child, but the jury saw the act as one of pure malice. After spending nearly 20 years on death row, one of the longest stays for a woman in Oklahoma history, she requested a final meal of grilled ribs, onion rings, strawberry pie, a banana, and cherry lemonade. The execution and last words. On December 4, 2001, Lois was the 3rd woman executed in Oklahoma in a single year. Her last words were an apology to the victim's family. "I want to tell you that I am sorry for all the pain I caused. Please forgive me. Being separated from the body is being with the Lord." Linda Lyon Block came from a background of high social standing and education. A former secretary and a woman of sharp intellect, she was deeply involved in the sovereign citizen movement. Her early life was spent in Orlando, Florida, where she developed a fierce distrust of government authority. This radical political shift eventually led her to leave her conventional life behind and go on the run with her common-law husband, George Sibley. In October 1993, while parked at a shopping center in Opelika, Alabama, a passerby noticed the couple's young son in the car and grew concerned. When Police Sergeant Roger Motley arrived to check on them, a tense confrontation began. Sibley opened fire first, but Linda quickly joined in. She fired several rounds at the officer, fatally wounding him. The couple claimed they were stateless and not subject to the law, but the jury disagreed. Both were sentenced to death. Linda Lyon Block was a woman of firm, almost cold conviction. On May 10, 2002, she declined to request a special last meal, making no demands of the state that she refused to recognize as legitimate. At the Holman Correctional Facility, Linda made history. She was the first woman executed in Alabama since 1957 and the last person in the state to die by the electric chair, known as Yellow Mama. She chose to make no final statement. At 12:01 a.m., the current was activated. She was pronounced dead 9 minutes later. 10. Aileen Wuornos, Florida. Aileen Wuornos had perhaps the most tragic early life of any woman on this list. Abandoned by her parents, she was raised by abusive grandparents. By age 14, she was pregnant, homeless, and surviving on the streets of Michigan. Her youth was a cycle of trauma, assault, and petty crime. She eventually drifted to Florida, where she worked as a highway prostitute, carrying a deep-seated rage toward the men she encountered. Between 1989 and 1990, Aileen became America's most famous female serial killer. She murdered 7 men along the Florida highways. While she initially claimed self-defense, stating the men had attempted to assault her, the evidence of robbery and the sheer number of victims led to her conviction. Her case became a media sensation, later immortalized in the film Monster. After a decade on death row, Aileen grew tired of the appeals process and begged the state to expedite her execution, claiming she would kill again if ever released. Aileen remained defiant until the very end. She refused the traditional last meal, requesting only a single cup of black coffee. On October 9, 2002, Aileen was led to the chamber. Her final words were a bizarre, rambling reference to her belief in a spiritual return. "I'll be back like the 4th of July with Jesus, June 6th, like in the movie with all the great mothership. I'll be back, I'll be back." 11. Frances Elaine Newton, Texas. Frances Newton grew up in the suburbs of Houston, Texas. To those who knew her, she was a standard mother and wife, but her marriage to Adrian Newton was crumbling under the weight of his drug debts and infidelity. Her early life was relatively unremarkable, which made the sudden, violent end of her family a shock to her community. In 1987, Frances's husband and her 2 young children, aged 7 and 21 months, were found shot to death in their apartment. Prosecutors argued that Frances had killed them to collect on a $50,000 life insurance policy she had taken out just 3 weeks prior. The murder weapon was found in a house Frances had visited shortly after the killings. Despite her claims that a drug dealer had murdered her family to send a message to her husband, she was found guilty. Her case sparked massive protests due to claims of mishandled evidence. Throughout her 17 years on death row, she maintained her innocence. On September 14, 2005, the day of her execution, she declined a last meal, spending her final hours in quiet reflection. As the first black woman executed in Texas since the 19th century, Frances chose to leave the world without a final statement. She looked at her surviving family through the glass, gave a small nod, and closed her eyes. She was pronounced dead at 6:17 p.m. 12. Teresa Wilson Bean Lewis, Virginia. Teresa Lewis was born in 1969 and grew up in a relatively modest environment. Throughout her early life, she was often described as a follower rather than a leader, someone easily influenced by those around her. She struggled with a lower-than-average IQ, which later became a focal point of her legal appeals. By her 30s, she had settled into a life in Danville, Virginia, married to Julian Clifton Lewis, but her domestic stability was a mask for a growing, greedy ambition. In 2002, Teresa orchestrated a cold-blooded plot to murder her husband and her 21-year-old stepson, Charles, who was a U.S. Army reservist. Her motive was a $250,000 life insurance policy. She recruited 2 young men, offering them money and sexual favors to carry out the killings. As they ambushed the men in their home, Teresa sat in the next room, listening. She waited 45 minutes after the shooting before calling 911, ensuring her husband would bleed out. When police arrived, they found her acting shaken, but she eventually confessed to being the mastermind. On September 23, 2010, Teresa requested a comfort food feast: fried chicken, buttered sweet peas, a slice of apple pie, and a Dr. Pepper. Teresa was the first woman executed in Virginia in nearly a century. As she was led to the chamber at the Greensville Correctional Center, she looked at her stepdaughter, Kathy, who was there to witness the execution. Her last words were a final plea for forgiveness. "I just want Kathy to know that I love you and I'm so sorry." She was pronounced dead at 9:13 p.m. 13. Kimberly McCarthy, Texas. Kimberly McCarthy's early years were shaped by a battle with addiction. A former occupational therapist, her life took a downward turn as she struggled with a long-term dependency on crack cocaine. This addiction stripped away her professional life and led her into a cycle of desperation and petty crime to fund her habit. By the late 1990s, the woman who had once been trained to help others had become a person capable of extreme violence. In 1997, Kimberly targeted her 71-year-old neighbor, Dorothy Booth, a retired professor. She entered the home under the pretense of needing a cup of sugar. Once inside, Kimberly attacked the elderly woman, stabbing her numerous times and cutting off her finger to steal a diamond ring. She then fled in the victim's Mercedes-Benz to pawn the jewelry for drugs. DNA evidence and the use of the victim's credit cards quickly led to her arrest. She was also a suspect in 2 other murders of elderly women, though she was never tried for them. On June 26, 2013, Kimberly did not make a special request, so she was served the standard prison menu. Kimberly's death was a grim milestone. She was the 500th person executed by the state of Texas since 1976. In her final moments at the Huntsville unit, she remained deeply spiritual, saying, "This is not a loss. This is a victory. Do you know where I'm going? I'm going home to be with Jesus. Keep the faith." Suzanne Basso was born in New York and had a history of creating elaborate fantasies about her life, often claiming to be wealthy or highly connected. Her early life was a patchwork of failed relationships and transient living. She eventually moved to Texas, where she developed a predatory reputation, often seeking out vulnerable individuals she could manipulate for financial support. In 1998, Suzanne met Louis Buddy Musso, a 59-year-old man with a developmental disability. She lured him to Texas with the promise of marriage, but instead, she and 5 accomplices turned his life into a nightmare. For days, Buddy was tortured, beaten with wire brushes, and submerged in a bathtub filled with chemicals. The group eventually killed him to claim his Social Security benefits. Suzanne was identified as the ringleader who orchestrated the brutality. On February 5, 2014, Suzanne declined to request a special last meal, accepting whatever was being served in the prison cafeteria that afternoon. By the time of her execution, Suzanne's health had declined significantly, and she appeared in the chamber in a wheelchair. When asked if she had any final words for the witnesses, she looked at the warden and simply said, "No, sir." She was pronounced dead at 6:26 p.m. 15. Lisa Coleman, Texas. Lisa Coleman grew up in the suburbs of Arlington, Texas. Her early life was relatively quiet, but as she entered adulthood, her personal relationships became increasingly isolated and toxic. She began a long-term partnership with Marcella Williams, and together, the 2 women created a household that was hidden from the eyes of social workers and neighbors, a seclusion that would eventually turn deadly for the child in their care. In 2004, the body of 9-year-old Devontai Williams was found in the apartment Coleman shared with his mother, Marcella. The scene was horrific. The boy was emaciated, weighing only 35 pounds, less than half the weight of a healthy child his age. Investigations revealed a long history of systemic torture. He had been bound with duct tape, beaten, and denied food for extended periods. While Marcella took a plea deal for life in prison, Lisa Coleman was sentenced to death for her role in the kidnapping and lethal neglect of the boy. 10 years after the crime, on September 17, 2014, Lisa Coleman did not request a special last meal, accepting the standard prison menu provided by the Huntsville unit. As she was prepared for lethal injection, Lisa appeared calm and focused on her remaining family. Her final words were, "I just want to tell my family I love them. My son, I love him. God is good. I'm done." She was pronounced dead at 6:24 p.m. 16. Kelly Gissendanner, Georgia. Kelly Gissendanner's early life followed a traditional path in the state of Georgia. She was a mother of 3 who, by all outward appearances, was deeply involved in her community and church. However, her marriage to Douglas Gissendanner was volatile, marked by multiple separations and reconciliations. It was during one of these off periods that she began an affair that would lead her to a dark and irreversible decision. In 1997, Kelly orchestrated the murder of her husband, Douglas. She didn't pull the trigger herself. Instead, she convinced her lover, Gregory Owen, to do it. Owen kidnapped Douglas, drove him to a remote wooded area, and stabbed him to death before setting his car on fire. Kelly's motive was the $500,000 life insurance policy and the deed to their home. Ironically, Owen took a plea deal for life in prison, while Kelly, as the mastermind, was sentenced to death. While on death row, she earned a degree in theology and became a symbol for prison reform advocates. Kelly requested a massive final meal that became a subject of media fascination. 2 Burger King Whoppers with cheese, 2 large orders of fries, cornbread with buttermilk, cherry vanilla ice cream, popcorn, and a salad with Paul Newman's buttermilk dressing. On September 30th, 2015, Kelly was the first woman executed in Georgia in 70 years. She spent her final moments singing Amazing Grace. Her last words were directed to her lawyer and her children. Tell my kids I left singing Amazing Grace. Tell the Gisendiner family that I am so very sorry. I just hope they find peace. 17. Lisa Marie Montgomery, Federal. Lisa Montgomery's background was a catalog of unimaginable trauma. Growing up in Kansas, she was subjected to years of severe physical and sexual abuse by her stepfather and mother. Experts later testified that this early life of horror led to permanent brain damage and severe mental illness, including pseudocyesis, a condition where a person falsely believes they are pregnant. In 2004, Lisa committed a crime that shocked the nation. She traveled to Missouri to meet 23-year-old Bobby Joe Stinnett under the guise of buying a puppy. Once inside the home, Lisa strangled the pregnant woman and performed a crude cesarean section to take the unborn child, whom she later tried to pass off as her own. The baby was miraculously recovered alive. Lisa's case went to the federal level, and after years of legal battles regarding her mental competency, she was ordered to be executed. On January 13, 2021, at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana, Lisa declined to make a special request for a last meal. Lisa was the first woman executed by the U.S. federal government in 67 years. When the warden asked if she had any final words, she simply replied, "No." She was pronounced dead at 1:31 a.m. 18. Amber McLaughlin, Missouri. Amber McLaughlin, known in her early life as Scott McLaughlin, grew up in the foster care system in Missouri. Her childhood was marked by instability and abuse. At one point, her foster father reportedly rubbed feces in her face as a form of punishment. As an adult, Amber struggled with mental health issues and gender dysphoria, eventually beginning a gender transition while incarcerated on death row. In 2003, Amber became obsessed with an ex-girlfriend, Beverly Genther. Despite a restraining order, Amber stalked her for weeks. On the night of November 20th, Amber waited outside Beverly's workplace and stabbed her to death, dumping the body near the Mississippi River. The jury at the trial could not agree on a death sentence, but under Missouri law, the judge was allowed to impose the death penalty himself, a move that sparked significant legal controversy. On January 3, 2023, Amber's final meal consisted of a cheeseburger, French fries, a strawberry milkshake, and a bag of peanut M, and Ms. Amber was the first openly transgender person executed in the United States. Her final written statement was simple and focused on accountability. "I am sorry for what I did. I am a loving and caring person. She was pronounced dead at 6:51 p.m. 19. Ethel Rosenberg, Federal, 1953. Ethel Greenglass was born in 1915 into a world of grinding poverty on New York City's Lower East Side. Her childhood was spent in a cramped tenement, the daughter of Jewish immigrants who struggled to make ends meet. Ethel was a woman of immense but frustrated talent. She possessed a powerful soprano voice and dreamed of a career on the professional stage. However, the Great Depression shattered those dreams, forcing her into a series of low-paying clerical jobs. In the 1930s, she found a sense of purpose in the labor movement and the Young Communist League. It was there she met Julius Rosenberg, an engineering student. They were a true believer couple, bound by a shared ideological vision that the Soviet Union represented the future of humanity. For Ethel, her devotion to Julius and their cause was absolute, providing her with the identity and belonging she had lacked in her youth. The Rosenbergs' downfall was a centerpiece of the Cold War Red Scare. In 1950, Ethel's brother, David Greenglass, was arrested for passing atomic secrets to the Soviets while working at Los Alamos. To protect his own wife, David testified that Ethel had personally typed up the secret notes that Julius then funneled to Soviet handlers. The trial was a media firestorm. The prosecution portrayed Ethel not as a housewife, but as a steely mastermind who was even more dedicated to the cause than her husband. Despite evidence that was largely circumstantial and based on her brother's testimony, both were convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage. For 2 years, they sat in Sing Sing, maintaining their innocence and writing heart-wrenching letters to their 2 young sons, becoming symbols of political martyrdom for some and traitors to others. On June 19, 1953, with the execution moved up to avoid the Jewish Sabbath, Ethel was served her final meal. She chose a simple, traditional dinner, but witnesses noted she barely touched the food. Her focus was entirely on the final letters she was drafting to her sons, advising them to always be proud of their name and to know that their parents died for their convictions. Ethel followed Julius into the execution chamber at Sing Sing. She was composed, wearing a dark dress and a stoic expression. In a famous show of grace, she kissed the prison matron on the cheek before being strapped into the chair. The execution became a source of horror when the first 3 jolts of electricity failed to kill her. Doctors found her heart still beating, necessitating 2 more massive applications of current. She died in a cloud of smoke at the age of 37. She left no formal final statement at the chair, but her final written words were, "I die with a clear conscience. Tell my sons I love them." 20. Barbara Graham, California, 1955. Barbara Graham, born in 1923, was a product of the California foster care and reformatory system. Her mother had been institutionalized when Barbara was a toddler, and Barbara herself spent her teenage years in state schools for wayward girls. She was strikingly beautiful, highly intelligent, and deeply cynical about authority. By her early 20s, she was a fixture in the underground jazz and gambling scenes of Los Angeles. She was a woman who lived for the fast life, moving through multiple marriages and associations with small-time criminals. Barbara wasn't a violent person by nature, but she was a drifter who prioritized survival and the next thrill over the law. In 1953, Barbara joined a gang of burglars who believed a wealthy widow, Mabel Monahan, had a safe full of cash in her Burbank home. The robbery went catastrophically wrong. When Monahan claimed there was no safe, she was beaten and strangled. Barbara's accomplices, seeking to avoid the gas chamber, pointed to her as the one who struck the fatal blows. The press loved the story of Bloody Babs, the glamorous femme fatale killer. Despite her claims of being home with her child, the jury was swayed by her criminal history and the testimony of her friends. Her struggle for clemency became the subject of national debate, eventually inspiring the movie I Want to Live. On the morning of June 3, 1955, after several agonizing last-minute stays of execution, Barbara was finally served her last meal. She requested a hot fudge sundae with nuts. She reportedly ate it with a sense of grim irony, remarking on the coldness of the ice cream compared to the heat of the legal battle. Barbara was led to the gas chamber at San Quentin wearing a blindfold. She didn't want to see the faces of the people watching her die. When a guard advised her to take a deep breath to make the end quicker, she famously snapped back with her trademark wit. Her final words, spoken as she was strapped into the chair, were, "Good people are always so sure they're right." 21. Bonnie Brown Hetty, Federal, 1953. Bonnie Brown Hetty was born in 1912 into a comfortable, respected farming family in Missouri. She was well-educated and social, but her life began to unravel following a series of failed marriages and a deepening dependence on alcohol. By the early 1950s, she was a lonely woman living in St. Joseph, Missouri, seeking companionship in local taverns. It was there she met Carl Hall, a career criminal who was as manipulative as he was violent. Bonnie became completely subservient to Hall, her judgment clouded by alcohol and an obsessive need for his affection. She followed him into a plan that would become one of the most hated crimes in American history. In September 1953, Bonnie walked into a private school and convinced the nuns she was the aunt of 6-year-old Bobby Greenlease, claiming his mother had been hospitalized. The nuns released the boy into her care. Within an hour, Carl Hall shot the boy in a field. Despite knowing the child was dead, the couple spent weeks taunting the family and demanding a $600,000 ransom. They were eventually caught in St. Louis after a drunken Hall showed off the massive amount of cash to a taxi driver. The brutality of kidnapping and murdering a child led to a swift federal trial and a double death sentence. For her final meal on December 18, 1953, Bonnie requested a simple but hearty dinner: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and a bottle of beer. She shared a final quiet moment with Hall before they were prepared for the chamber. In a rare and grim scene, Bonnie and Carl were executed side by side in the Missouri gas chamber. It was a cold, efficient procedure. As the gas rose around them, Bonnie remained silent, staring straight ahead as the cyanide took effect. She made no final statement, dying alongside the man she had followed into the abyss. 22. Martha Beck, New York, 1951. Martha Beck was born in Florida in 1920. Her childhood was marked by severe bullying due to a glandular disorder that caused her to be significantly overweight. This early ostracization left her with a desperate, pathologically intense need for love and validation. She became a nurse, seeking a profession where she could exercise control and care. In 1947, she met Raymond Fernandez through a Lonely Hearts Club. Raymond was a con man, but to Martha, he was the answer to every prayer. Her obsession with him was so absolute that she abandoned her own children to join him on a cross-country criminal spree fueled by a jealousy that would eventually lead to murder. The duo targeted lonely women who had placed ads in correspondence clubs. Raymond would seduce them, and Martha, posing as his sister, would move into their homes. While the original goal was theft, Martha's uncontrollable jealousy of the women Raymond romanced led to violence. They murdered at least 3 people, including a widow and her 2-year-old daughter in Michigan. The sheer coldness of their crimes and Martha's vocal, obsessive love for Raymond, even after their arrest, fascinated and repulsed the public. They were convicted in New York for the murder of Janet Fay. On March 8, 1951, Martha Beck requested a meal that reflected her lifelong search for comfort: fried chicken, French fries, and a salad. She ate with a calm, almost cheerful demeanor, telling the guards she was ready to be reunited with Raymond. Martha followed Raymond into the electric chair at Sing Sing. As she was strapped in, she spoke of her love for her accomplice one last time. Her final words were, "My story is a love story, but only those with love can understand. What does it matter who I am? I have a great love for Raymond." 23. Anna Antonio, New York, 1934. Anna Antonio was born in 1906, an Italian immigrant who came to America seeking the golden dream, only to find the crushing reality of the Great Depression. She settled in Albany, New York, and married Pasquale Antonio, a man known to have ties to local organized crime. Her early life was a cycle of fear. Pasquale was a violent and abusive husband who reportedly held a gun to her head on multiple occasions. Anna spent her years as a housewife and mother of 3, living in a constant state of hypervigilance, trying to shield her children from their father's rage. By the time the 1930s arrived, the family was destitute, and Anna was a woman pushed to the very edge of her psychological endurance. In 1932, Pasquale Antonio was found dead by a roadside, having been stabbed 15 times and beaten. 2 men, Vincent Saietta and Sam Faraci, were quickly arrested. To save themselves, they claimed that Anna had hired them to kill her husband so she could collect a $5,000 life insurance policy. Anna's defense was that her husband was a small-time hood who had been killed by his own associates over gambling debts, and that the men were framing her to avoid the chair. The trial became a sensation, focusing on the wicked immigrant wife. Despite 3 separate stays of execution and a lack of physical evidence linking her to the killers, the political pressure for a conviction was too high. She spent 16 months in the death house at Sing Sing, maintaining her innocence until the very end. On August 9, 1934, Anna Antonio spent her final hours in a state of deep religious devotion. She declined to eat a special last meal, choosing instead to fast and pray with her priest. She told the guards that she wanted her soul to be clean when she met her Maker. Anna had to be supported by 2 guards as she walked to the electric chair. She was so weak from her fast and her grief that she could barely stand. She was 28 years old. As the leather straps were tightened, she whispered her final words, a soft prayer for her children. "I am innocent. God knows I am innocent. May He take care of my children." 24. Louise Peete, California, 1947. Louise Peete was born Lofi Louise Preslar in 1880 in Louisiana. Her early life was one of comfort, but she was a natural-born manipulator who was expelled from school for various moral lapses. She was a sociopath who used her refined Southern manners and soft, charming voice to gain the trust of wealthy individuals. Throughout her youth, she moved across the country, leaving a trail of mysterious deaths and suicides of men who had been in her life. She was a woman who didn't look like a killer. She looked like a grandmother, a caregiver, and a loyal friend, a mask she used with deadly efficiency for over 4 decades. Louise had already served 18 years for a murder in the 1920s when she was paroled in 1943. She was taken in by a kind-hearted woman named Margaret Logan. Within a year, Margaret disappeared. Louise told neighbors that Margaret had gone to a hospital for a nervous breakdown. In reality, Louise had shot her and buried her in the backyard garden. She then spent months living in the Logan house, using Margaret's checkbook and even taking care of Margaret's husband, Arthur, who never realized his wife was buried just outside the window. When the police finally searched the property and found the body, Louise simply smiled and said it must have been a mistake. She was convicted of first-degree murder in a trial that gripped the West Coast. On April 11, 1947, Louise remained as composed as if she were hosting a garden party. For her last meal, she requested a classic comfort spread: fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, buttered peas, and a slice of apple pie. Louise was the second woman to die in California's gas chamber. She walked to the chair wearing a green suit and a necklace, nodding politely to the executioners as they strapped her in. She showed no fear as the cyanide pellets were dropped. Her last words were a calm, polite instruction to the guards. "I'm ready, boys. It's quite all right." 25. Eva Koo, New York, 1935. Eva Koo was a Canadian immigrant who moved to Oneonta, New York, and established a roadhouse, a combination of a tavern, a boarding house, and a brothel during the Prohibition era. She was a rugged, hard-drinking woman who was known to be the boss of her small community. Her early life was spent in the rough-and-tumble world of illegal alcohol sales and petty crime. She was a woman who had survived by her wits in a man's world, but she developed a cold-blooded greed that would eventually lead to her downfall. In 1934, Eva was accused of murdering a simple-minded handyman named Harry Wright, who lived at her roadhouse. She had taken out several life insurance policies on Wright, totaling about $10,000. Prosecutors argued that Eva, along with an accomplice named Martha Clift, drove Wright to a remote mountain road, hit him over the head with a mallet, and then ran over him with a car to make it look like a hit-and-run accident. The plan failed when investigators found blood in Eva's car, and Clift turned state's evidence against her. The press dubbed her the Roadhouse Murderess, and her trial was a media sensation. On June 27, 1935, Eva Koo requested a hearty final meal that reflected her no-nonsense personality: roast pork with applesauce, mashed potatoes, and a side of mixed vegetables. As she was led to the electric chair at Sing Sing, Eva remained a tough, brassy figure until the very end. She refused to show any sign of weakness to the reporters watching her. Her last words, shouted as she was being prepared for the current, were, "Goodbye, boys. I'll see you in the next world." 26. Mary Frances Creighton, New York, 1936. Mary Frances Creighton was born in 1899 and lived a life that, on the surface, appeared to be the model of middle-class domesticity in Newark, New Jersey, and later Long Island. However, a dark shadow followed her from a young age. In 1923, she and her husband, John Creighton, were acquitted of poisoning Mary's mother-in-law. Despite the acquittal, rumors persisted in their community that Mary was a black widow who used her kitchen as a laboratory for lethal concoctions. Her early life was marked by a chilling lack of empathy and a penchant for solving financial or domestic problems with a dash of arsenic in the family dinner. In 1935, the Creightons moved into a home in Baldwin, Long Island, next door to a woman named Ada Applegate. Mary soon began an affair with Ada's husband, Everett Applegate. To clear the way for her new romance and to claim a small insurance policy, Mary began systematically poisoning Ada with arsenic. She even recruited her own 15-year-old daughter to help administer the medicine. When Ada died, an anonymous tip led to an autopsy that revealed lethal levels of poison. The trial was a media sensation, as the public was horrified by the image of a mother teaching her daughter how to kill. On July 16, 1936, at Sing Sing Prison, Mary Frances Creighton was too physically and emotionally broken to eat. She declined a final meal, spending her last hours in a state of near catatonic shock. Mary's execution is remembered as one of the most gruesome in New York history. She was so paralyzed by fear that she could not walk. She had to be carried into the execution chamber on a chair. As she was strapped into the electric chair, she remained essentially unresponsive, her eyes closed in a state of terror. She made no final statement, dying in a heavy silence that was broken only by the hum of the current. 27. Elizabeth Duncan, California, 1962. Elizabeth Ann Duncan was born in 1904. Her early life was defined by a series of failed relationships and a pathological, borderline obsessive attachment to her son, Frank. She was a woman who could not tolerate the idea of another person coming between her and her child. Throughout Frank's adulthood, Elizabeth used manipulation, fake illnesses, and financial control to keep him under her thumb. She was a woman who viewed the world as a battlefield, and anyone who threatened her bond with her son was an enemy to be eliminated. In 1958, Frank secretly married a nurse named Olga. When Elizabeth found out, she spiraled into a murderous rage. She first tried to have the marriage annulled through fraud, and when that failed, she hired two drifters, Augustine Baldonado and Luis Moya, to murder her pregnant daughter-in-law. The men kidnapped Olga, beat her, and buried her alive in a shallow grave in the Casitas Pass. The investigation quickly led back to Elizabeth, whose hatred for Olga was well known. The trial was a national scandal, portraying Elizabeth as the ultimate mother from hell. On August 8, 1962, Elizabeth Duncan requested a final meal that was as simple as her motives were complex: a steak, a green salad, and a cup of black coffee. Elizabeth was the last woman executed in California before the 1972 moratorium. As she was led into the gas chamber at San Quentin, she remained fixated on her son. Her last words were a final testament to her obsession. "Where is Frank? I want to see my son. I'm innocent, and I love my son." Juanita Spinelli was born in 1889 and moved to San Francisco, where she eventually became known as the Duchess. Unlike many women on this list who killed for passion or insurance, Juanita was a career criminal and a gang leader. She ran a crew of young muggers and thieves, acting as both a maternal figure and a cold-blooded boss. Her early life in the criminal underworld taught her that loyalty was the only currency, and she had a reputation for dealing harshly with anyone who showed weakness or threatened the safety of her family. In 1940, during a botched robbery, one of her gang members, Leland Cook, became a liability. Fearful that the young man would snitch to the authorities, Juanita ordered his execution. She drugged him with whiskey and then drove him to a bridge over the Sacramento River. With the help of her gang, she threw the unconscious man into the water to ensure his silence. When the body was recovered and a gang member turned state's evidence, the Duchess was sentenced to die. On November 21, 1941, Juanita Spinelli requested a final meal that reflected her practical, no-nonsense nature: a hamburger with onions, French fries, and a bottle of beer. Juanita was the first woman ever executed in the California gas chamber. She was terrified of the procedure and had to be strapped into the chair with extra restraints to keep her from struggling. As the cyanide gas began to rise, she remained silent, her eyes tightly shut. She chose to make no final statement, dying with the secrets of her criminal empire intact. 29. Rhoda Mae Abbott, New Jersey, 1944. Rhoda May Abbott was born in the early 1900s into a world that was rapidly changing. Her early life was spent in the industrial heartland of New Jersey, where she worked in various manual labor jobs to support her family. Like many during the 1930s, she was deeply affected by the economic collapse of the Great Depression. Her marriage was a volatile one, marked by financial strain and frequent arguments over their dwindling resources. Neighbors described her as a woman who was hardened by her circumstances, someone who had learned to survive by any means necessary in a society that offered little support to struggling women. In 1943, Rhoda's husband, Charles Abbott, fell ill after eating a home-cooked meal. What initially seemed like a case of food poisoning quickly turned fatal. Investigators, suspicious of Rhoda's calm demeanor following her husband's death, ordered an autopsy. The results were undeniable. Charles had been systematically poisoned with arsenic over several weeks. Prosecutors argued that Rhoda had grown tired of her husband's inability to provide for the family and sought to claim a modest life insurance policy to start a new life. During the trial, the prosecution painted her as a calculating Borgia of the modern era, while her defense argued she was a victim of a broken home who had simply snapped under the pressure of poverty. On the evening of her execution in 1944, Rhoda May Abbott requested a final meal that reflected her humble roots: a plate of fried chicken, mashed potatoes with thick gravy, and a slice of peach pie. Rhoda was led to the electric chair at the New Jersey State Prison. She was a small, fragile-looking woman who seemed swallowed by the large wooden chair. As the leather straps were tightened around her wrists and ankles, she remained stoic, refusing to cry or plead for mercy. Her final words were a simple request for her children. "Tell my children I love them, and I hope they find a better life than I had." 30. Lena Baker, Georgia, 1945. Lena Baker's early life was a struggle for dignity in a world that denied it to her. Born in 1901 in Cuthbert, Georgia, she was an African-American woman living in the heart of the deeply segregated South. She spent her youth picking cotton and working as a maid for white families to support her 3 children. Lena was a woman who had known only hard labor and the systemic oppression of the Jim Crow era. In the early 1940s, she was hired to care for Ernest Knight, an older white man who was known in the community for his violent outbursts and heavy drinking. It was a job that would eventually lead to her destruction. Lena testified that Knight frequently held her captive and threatened her life. On the night of the crime, Knight allegedly locked Lena in a grist mill and told her she would never leave alive. During a desperate struggle for a pistol Knight was brandishing, the gun went off, striking Knight in the head and killing him instantly. Despite Lena's clear testimony of self-defense and the history of abuse she had endured, an all-white, all-male jury found her guilty of murder in less than an hour. The trial was a textbook example of the racial injustice of the era, where the word of a black woman carried no weight against the life of a white man. On March 5, 1945, Lena Baker was prepared for the electric chair. For her final meal, she declined any special request, stating that she was full of the Lord's Spirit and did not need earthly food. Lena was led into the chamber at the Georgia State Prison. She was the only woman ever executed in the state's electric chair. As the hood was placed over her head, she spoke with a clarity and calm that moved many in the room. Her last words were, "What I done, I did in self-defense. I have nothing against no one. I am ready to meet my God." In 2005, 60 years after her execution, the state of Georgia issued a full posthumous pardon, acknowledging that a grievous error had been made in her case.